The morning the horses came off the trailer, it was a Tuesday in late October of 1987, and the fog was sitting so low over the creek bottom that you could not see the near fence line from the barn door. I remember standing there with a cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere between the house and the yard, watching the truck and trailer come up the county road at a speed that suggested the driver was not proud of his cargo and was not planning to stay long enough to discuss it. He was right on both counts. The rig was a single-axle two-horse that had been pressed into hauling 12 animals, which tells you something about the economics of the situation. And the animals themselves came off that trailer in a way that told you something else. Not wild, not panicked, just depleted in a manner that goes bone deep, the way a horse gets depleted when it has been asked to keep giving after it has already given everything it had. They stood in the lot, and they dropped their heads, and they breathed, and that was about all they did. 12 mares. Average age somewhere around 11, though a couple were older than that by several years. A paint that had a hip you could read like a map of hard country, a gray that had clearly been a fine-boned pretty thing once, and still carried that quality in her face, even if the rest of her had been spent down to almost nothing. 3 bays that were full sisters out of the same dam, which I knew because I had looked into this before I bought them, and I want to be honest about that. I had done my homework. The trader who sold them to me did not know that, and he talked to me accordingly, with the kind of generous condescension a man uses when he believes he is doing you a favor by not laughing openly. He said, and I am quoting him as close as memory allows, that those nags were Buzzard bait, and that I would be out my money and my time before spring. He said it pleasantly. He pocketed his check, loaded his trailer, and drove back down the county road a good deal faster than he had come up it. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. In the version the diner had, I had paid twice what I actually paid, and the horses had arrived in a condition approaching skeletal, which was an exaggeration, though not by as much as I would have liked. I did not go to the diner that week. I had work to do. What I had not told the trader, and what I had not told the diner, and what I had not yet fully told myself, was why I had bought those 12 particular animals out of all the culled and worn-out mares that were moving through sale barns that fall. The reason was not sentiment, though people assumed it was. The reason was not foolishness, though people assumed that too. The reason was a marbled composition notebook that had belonged to my grandfather, and one line in that notebook that I had been carrying around in the back of my mind for going on 11 years without knowing what to do with it. I will get to the notebook. I want to earn it first. My grandfather had run horses on this place from roughly 1931 until he died in the fall of 1969. He was not a romantic about them. He was a working horseman in the old manner, which meant he thought about horses the way a careful engineer thinks about a load-bearing structure. He thought about what they were built for, what they could sustain, what broke them, and what kept them sound. He kept records the way some men keep a daily log of weather, which is to say, methodically and without self-consciousness, because the information mattered and needed to be somewhere besides his head. When he died, those records went into a cedar chest in the back room of this house, and the cedar chest went more or less undisturbed for the better part of a decade, and then my father went through it looking for a deed, and found the notebooks, and put them back. And they stayed there until the winter of 1976, when I was 22 years old, and pulled them out on a slow January evening with nothing better to do. There were 9 notebooks in total. 8 of them were what you would expect: foaling dates, breeding records, pasture rotation, feed costs, veterinary notes going back to a time when veterinary notes were mostly written by the horseman himself, because a vet was an expensive proposition, and not always a proximate one. Detailed, careful. The kind of document that makes you feel you are standing in the room with the man who wrote it, watching his hands. The 9th notebook was different. It was thinner than the others, and the entries were less regular, and there was a quality to the writing that suggested He was working something out rather than recording something settled. My grandfather was not a man who worked things out on paper in my experience. He worked things out walking or leaning on a fence or sitting in a truck with the engine idling. The fact that he had written this one down meant it mattered to him, and the fact that it was unfinished meant he had not gotten where he was going before he ran out of time. I read it through twice that January evening, and I put it back in the cedar chest, and I did not think about it as carefully as I should have for a long time afterward. I will own that. The confession of postponement is part of the story, and I would rather tell it honestly than leave it out. What the ninth notebook was about, in the simplest terms I can give you, was a question my grandfather had been asking himself in the last several years of his life about a particular kind of mare. Not a breed precisely, or not only a breed, but a type. A structural and temperamental type that he had observed across 30-some years of watching horses work this kind of country, which is rough and dry and uneven and does not forgive an animal that was built for a different landscape. He had words for the type, his own words, a vocabulary he had made up to describe what he was seeing, and some of those words were practical engineering language, and some of them were the kind of language a man uses when he is trying to say something he does not quite have the standard vocabulary for. He wrote about bone density in relation to hoof angle in a way that anticipated things I would later read in formal literature by people with credentials behind their names. He wrote about a particular quality of hip that he called drive-through, meaning not width, but depth, a structural quality that showed in how an animal used its hindquarters in rough going. He wrote about what he called the quiet kind of honest, which was his phrase for mares that would give you their effort without being asked twice and without drama, the kind of honest that does not announce itself because it does not know how. And across the notebook, woven through the observations and the sketches and the feed calculations, there were references to a bloodline, not a famous bloodline, not a bloodline you would find in any registry that mattered to the people who ran registries. A working bloodline that had come up through this part of the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries passed from one small operator to the next through private sales and handshake deals and the kind of horse trading that left no paper because paper was considered an insult to a man's word. My grandfather had encountered it first around 1934 and had been tracing it ever since. He had found it in 7 different barns across maybe 4 counties over the course of 35 years, always in the same kind of place, always being run by the same kind of man, always showing the same structural and temperamental signatures, no matter what had been bred to it in the intervening generations. That consistency, that persistence of type across uncontrolled breeding and hard conditions was what had caught his attention. He believed it was a sign of something old and fixed in the genetics, something laid down in foundation stock that had been working this specific landscape so long that the landscape had become part of the animal. He had a phrase for that. He wrote it on the inside back cover of the 9th notebook, and he underlined it twice, and he put a question mark after it the way a man puts a question mark after something he believes but cannot yet prove. The phrase was, "The ground remembers." Underneath it, in smaller letters, he had written a name. The name was the name of a particular mare he had owned for 11 years and sold in 1959, when money was tight, a decision he had clearly not made peace with because the entry about the sale was the most emotionally legible thing in all 9 notebooks, and my grandfather was not a demonstrative writer. He had sold her to a man 3 counties over, and he had tried twice to buy her back, and he had failed, and she had disappeared into the chain of private sales that such animals disappear into, and that was the end of the trail as he had been able to follow it. The question mark after the ground remembers was, I believed, partly about the bloodline and partly about that mare. He had wanted to find where it had gone. He had not managed it before he died. The 9th notebook had no last entry. It simply stopped. I want to tell you something about reading a document like that at 22 years old, and then again at 33, which is when I read it the second time, and again at 38 when I read it a third time. A document like that changes as you change. The first time I read it, I understood the words, and I missed the weight of them. The second time, I understood the weight, but I did not know what to do with it. The third time, in the spring of 1987, I read it, and I understood both the words and the weight. And I also understood for the first time that my grandfather had left it for whoever came after. Not because he knew I would find it. He did not operate with that kind of deliberate drama. But because a man who keeps records keeps them as a gift to the future without calling it that, the same way a man who fixes a fence properly does it partly for whoever will walk that fence line after he is gone. He had done the work. He had left the map. The question mark was mine to answer. So when the horses came off that trailer on a Tuesday in late October of 1987, and the trader said what he said and drove away, and the 12 mares stood in the lot with their heads down in the low fog, I was not looking at buzzard bait. I was looking at the end of a thread I had been trying to find the beginning of for 11 years. I had spent the better part of the previous 8 months following what my grandfather had followed, tracing the line of private sales and word-of-mouth knowledge through a chain of people who mostly did not know they were part of a chain. The mare he had sold in 1959 had produced foals. Those foals had gone to different places. Most of the trail was cold, but there were 3 lines of descent I had been able to track with reasonable confidence, and 2 of them had intersected at a single sale barn in the fall of 1986, and the animals that had come out of that intersection were the ones I was looking at now. The 3 bay mares who were full sisters were the most direct connection I had found. Their dams, 3 generations back, carried what I believed was the structural signature my grandfather had described, the drive-through hip, the particular quality of bone, the quiet kind of honest. I could not prove that with a registry. There was no registry. What I had was the notebook, my own eyes, and the conviction of a man I trusted who had been dead for 18 years. That is not nothing. But I want to be honest about how thin a margin it felt like standing at that fence in the fog in October. The extension agent had come out the previous week before the horses arrived, when I had described what I was attempting. He was a decent man. He had a clipboard and a column of numbers that represented the average return on a rehabilitation and breeding operation of this type and scale over a 5-year horizon, and the column did not look favorable. He said that bloodline preservation of undocumented stock was, and I am paraphrasing but not by much, more of a hobby than a business proposition. He said it kindly. He left his card. I put it on the workbench, and it stayed there under a washer and a piece of wire for the better part of 2 years. I did not call him. I had 12 mares in the lot, and a notebook full of my grandfather's careful thinking, and a question mark I intended to answer. The first winter was about nothing more complicated than feed and rest and patience, and I want to slow down here, because people underestimate what that season of work actually costs, not just in money, though it cost a great deal in money, but in attention. Nursing a depleted animal back is not a passive thing. It is a daily practice of observation that requires you to set aside what you think you see and look at what is actually there. The paint mare with the hard-used hip, whose name I had settled on by the second week, which was November by then, and cold enough to see your breath at morning chores, she was the one who worried me most at the start, and the one who would surprise me most by spring. The gray, who I had thought was closer to the edge than the others, turned out to have a resilience in her that showed up in the first hard week of December when the temperature dropped and stayed down for 11 days, and I lost sleep over all of them, and she was the one who ate the best and stood the most quietly, and seemed, in the understated way of a sensible horse, to be informing me that she had been through worse. You learn things in a winter like that. You learn which animals carry their trouble on the outside and which ones carry it in. You learn which ones will tell you when something is wrong, and which ones will manage it quietly until they can't, and the second kind requires a different quality of watching. My grandfather had written about this in the 6th notebook, not the 9th, in an entry from February of 1952. He had written that the animal that doesn't complain is the one that earns your closest attention, because silence in a horse is not the same as absence of need. I had read that at 22 and thought I understood it. I understood it better that December. I was out before 5 every morning. I walked the lot. I watched them at the hay, and I watched them at the water, and I watched them when they moved across the pen, because the way an animal moves at liberty, without agenda, tells you things that a veterinary examination can confirm, but cannot replace. By February, I had a working picture of each of the 12. What was structural and what was conditional, what would improve with time and feed, and what had been put there by hard use and was not going to fully leave. The 3 Bay sisters were the ones I thought about most in that regard. I had been looking at them for 4 months by February, and the structural case my grandfather's notebook had described, the hip, the bone, the particular quality of the shoulder that preceded the drive-through, it was there. It was attenuated by the condition they were in, but it was there the way a good piece of work is still recognizable, even under neglect. That was when I let myself believe, for the first time with something approaching confidence, that I had found the right animals. I want to be precise about when that moment happened, because it matters to the story. It was a Thursday morning in February of 1988. The temperature was 12 degrees, and there was a skim of new snow on the ground, and the light was coming up thin and gray over the east pasture, and the 3 Bay mares were moving together along the south fence, not being driven, just moving, at the easy ground-covering walk that is the signature gait of an animal built correctly for long country. I stood at the fence for a long time and watched them, and I thought about a line from the 9th notebook, a line that was not the one that had haunted me, but one I had passed over too quickly in earlier readings. My grandfather had written, in reference to the mares he had watched carrying this bloodline, that they moved like they owned the ground they were on, not with arrogance, but with familiarity, as though the land and the animal had reached an agreement some time previous and were simply continuing it. I watched those 3 mares walk the fence line in the gray February light, and I knew what he meant. I went back inside, and I put the notebook on the kitchen table, and I sat down with a cup of hot coffee, and I stayed there for a while without doing anything in particular. My wife asked me how they looked. I told her I thought we were where we needed to be. She asked how many acres we were planning to breed to this spring. I told her I was thinking about the East 40 and the creek pasture, maybe 60 acres total, and we would see. She did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "All right." And that was the decision made. Spring arrived late in 1988, which is to say it arrived on its own schedule, which is the only schedule spring has ever operated on, regardless of what the almanac says. The breeding season started in April with a stallion I had located the previous fall through a careful process. I will describe only by saying that it took me 4 months and 3 trips and 1 unreturned phone call, and eventually a conversation at a feed store in a county I did not normally do business in, with a man who had known my grandfather and who said, when I described what I was looking for, that he thought he might know where to send me. The stallion was 16 years old and had spent his whole life in working service on rough country, and he was, to an unprepared eye, an unimpressive animal, not large, not flashy. The kind of horse that a person accustomed to thinking about horses in terms of appearance would walk past without a second look. The man who owned him was asking a breeding fee that was low by any standard of the time, not because the horse was not worth more, but because the owner was in his late 70s and was not interested in the arithmetic of maximizing return. He was interested in where the get was going and what it was going to be used for. We talked for 2 hours at his kitchen table, and at the end of those 2 hours he said, and I believed him, that he had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The questions I had asked, which came substantially out of my grandfather's 9th notebook, were apparently in that category. He shook my hand, and he quoted me a fee, and I paid it without negotiating because some transactions are not about the money, even when money changes hands. The first foals hit the ground in the spring of 1989, and by the spring of 1991, I had enough of them on the ground to begin to see what I was working with. And what I was working with was this. The structural type my grandfather had described in the notebook was reproducing with a consistency that was, to my eye and to my measurement, not accidental. I was keeping my own records by then in my own notebook, which was also a marbled composition book, also pencil, also on the same workbench shelf where I had found the cedar chest key 11 years earlier. I had 17 foals on the ground across 2 foaling seasons. 14 of them showed the structural signatures in sufficient degree to be worth following forward. That is an 82% expression rate in the first-generation cross of Murray's. I had selected for the type and a stallion whose owner had selected for the same things for a longer time than I had been paying attention. That number is not a number I invented. I measured those animals the way my grandfather's notebook described, hip depth and bone circumference and shoulder angle, using a set of measurements he had standardized in the 5th notebook and which I had converted to a protocol I could apply consistently. The numbers agreed with what I was seeing. They nearly always do if you are looking at the right things. I want to tell you about the soil scientist, because the soil scientist is part of this story, even though horses and soil seem like separate subjects. They are not separate subjects. My grandfather understood that the landscape and the animal had made an agreement, as he put it, and that agreement was partly about the specific mineral composition of the ground, which shaped the grass, which shaped the bone of every animal that had grazed it long enough. I had been thinking about that quietly for several years when, in the fall of 1991, I met a man named, well, I will call him the Soil Man, because I'm not going to put his full name into this without his asking me to, who had been doing transect surveys in this part of the county for a state agricultural extension project. He came to my place because my east pasture was one of his survey sites, and we got to talking while he was pulling cores, and I made the mistake, or the fortunate move, depending on how you look at it, of showing him the 9th notebook. He read slowly. He is the kind of reader who reads with his whole body, leaning forward, one hand on the page, the way a man leans into a wind to hear something better. He read for maybe 20 minutes while I stood at the fence and watched him read. And when he finished, he was quiet for a while, and then he said one word, which was remarkable, and then he was quiet again. I asked him what specifically he thought was remarkable. He said that the mineral profile of the base soil in the creek bottom and the east pasture was consistent with what you would expect to produce in grazing animals a particular calcium to phosphorus ratio in the bone development, and that the structural characteristics my grandfather had described as the drive-through hip and the dense bone were not merely a genetic signature, but were also, and he used the word supported by the nutritional environment of this specific ground. He said he had never seen a working horseman's notebook that had arrived at a working mineral hypothesis without the soil data, just from watching animals long enough. He said it was exceptional. I told him my grandfather had been watching for 35 years. He said that explained it. He took a copy of the relevant pages of the 9th notebook, and he included a reference to it in his survey report, and I have that report in the cedar chest now, next to the 9 original notebooks. And I look at it sometimes when I need to remember that patience is not just a virtue, but a methodology. What the soil man had confirmed in the restrained language of a careful scientist was that the ground remembers, not metaphorically, literally. The calcium is in the grass, and the grass is in the bone, and the bone is in the movement, And the movement is what my grandfather had watched and called the drive-through, and the quiet kind of honest. And the whole chain of it was tied to this particular piece of ground in a way that no amount of registry paperwork could have created or documented, because it had been made over 100 years of animals grazing a specific soil and carrying what the soil gave them into their get. The question mark at the back of the 9th notebook had an answer. The ground remembers. It had been remembering the whole time. By the fall of 1993, which is 6 years from the morning those 12 mares came off the trailer in the fog, I had 31 horses on this place that I believed were genuine carriers of the type. Not all of the original 12 had contributed equally. 3 of the mares had not produced get that showed the signatures clearly, and I had not bred them again after the first season, because I was not trying to make as many horses as possible. I was trying to make the right ones. That distinction is not obvious to everyone, and I want to say a word about it because it is the distinction that separates the work from the commerce. The work is not the same as the commerce. The commerce is the thing that keeps the work alive. And I am not dismissive of commerce. I have a mortgage and I buy diesel. And neither of those facts is negotiable. But the commerce is in service to the work and not the other way around. My grandfather had written something on this subject in the 7th notebook. He had written that you cannot farm what you have already spent. He meant it in the context of soil, but he would have applied it equally to horses. You cannot build a bloodline by liquidating it. You have to hold the core and build from the edge, and the core costs you more than you will recover in any single season, or probably in a decade of seasons. And you have to be willing to do the arithmetic on that and look it in the eye and decide that the thing you are building is worth more than the thing you could have instead. In 1993, I sold 8 horses. The prices I received for those 8 horses were, by the measure of the sale barn and the extension agent's column of numbers, good prices. They were not extraordinary prices. They were good prices for working horses with no papers and no pedigree and no history that a buyer could point to and cite. What the buyers were pointing to, the ones who came and looked and decided to write a check, was what they saw when the horses moved, not what they were told, what they saw. A rancher from 2 counties over came in the late summer of that year, and he spent 4 hours on my place, and he watched the horses for most of those 4 hours without saying very much. And at the end of that time, he said he would take 2 of the 3-year-olds if I would hold them until October, and I said I would. He loaded them in October, and he called me the following spring, and he said, and his words were careful in the way of a man who does not give compliments carelessly, that those 2 horses had been worth every dollar, and then some. He said they had worked through a full January in conditions he would not want to work a horse he did not trust, and they had come through it better than horses he had paid twice as much for. That conversation mattered to me more than any sale price. Not because I needed the validation, but because it was a data point. It was one piece of evidence in an accumulating case. My grandfather had built his case across 35 years and 9 notebooks. I was in my 6th year. I had time. The neighbor who had watched me unload those mares in October of 1987 with the particular expression of a man who was being polite about his certainty, he came by in the fall of 1994. He drove the same truck, or one very much like it, still cleaner than it had any reason to be. He pulled up to the fence where I was working on a post, and he looked out at the east pasture where about 20 of the horses were grazing, and he sat there for a while without saying anything, which was different from the last time. The last time he had known exactly what he thought and had said it promptly. This time he appeared to be looking at something he was recalibrating his thinking around, and that process was taking him a moment. He finally said that those were not bad-looking horses. I said, "Thank you." He said that the one near the far fence, the dark bay 4-year-old, what was she out of? I told him she was out of one of the original mares, 3rd foal, and he nodded, as though that confirmed something he had been considering. He said that she moved well. I said she did. He said that was not as rough a lot as he had expected, meaning the whole program, meaning the whole 7 years of it. And then he said he had to get back. And he put his window up, and he drove back down the county road at a reasonable speed. That was the concession. I did not expect a parade, and I did not get one, and I would not have wanted one. A man who has been quietly wrong for 7 years is entitled to be quietly right about it in his own time, and what he had said was enough. More than enough, if I am being honest. I stood at that fence post for a few minutes after his truck was gone, and I thought about my grandfather standing at some fence on this place, watching the ancestors of those same animals moving in some other October light, writing it down in a marbled notebook, underlining the thing he believed and putting a question mark after it, because he was an honest man who knew the difference between what he had seen and what he had proven. I thought about the 11 years I had carried that question mark around without knowing what to do with it, and the 8 months of searching before the purchase, and the first cold winter, and the gray mare who had eaten well through 11 days of hard freeze, and the 3 bays walking the fence line in the February light with the snow on the ground, moving like they owned the ground they were on. And I thought about the soil man reading the notebook with his body leaning forward into it, and the single word he had said after 20 minutes of careful reading. I thought about all of it as one thing, because it is one thing. It is one long act of attention, beginning with a man who was born in 1901 and died in 1969, and ending, if it has ended, somewhere I have not arrived at yet. The ground remembers. That is what the notebook said. I believe it is true of more than soil. I believe it is true of the work itself, that the careful thing you do, the thing you do without knowing if anyone is watching, or if it will come to anything, has a way of persisting past the moment and past the man. You cannot always know who will find the notebook. You cannot always know if the question mark will get its answer. You can only do the work as carefully as you know how, and leave the record as honestly as you can, and trust that the ground will hold it. That is what my grandfather did. That is what I am trying to do. If you are out there with your own piece of work that people drove past without slowing down, your own overlooked thing that you have been quiet about because it is too early or too uncertain, or because the trader was too confident when he told you it would amount to nothing, I would like to hear about it. Leave it in the comments if you are of a mind to. And if this kind of telling is worth something to you, subscribe. Because we move slow on this channel, but I believe we get where we are going.